Good afternoon, everybody. This is Mick Napier with the weekly Sunday interview with someone we think has something significant to contribute to the conversation about delivering effective solidarity to the people of Palestine. This week we have Ran Greenstein speaking from South Africa. We've just been wrestling with a small technical problem, but it seems that we have overcome it. Ran, a big welcome to you in South Africa. Where are you?
I'm in Johannesburg.
Okay, the Big Apple, yeah, in South Africa. Ran is the author of this book, Zionism and its Discontents, and you can also see it behind me here. I've just finished reading most of it, and I found it extremely valuable indeed. Ran, at the beginning of the book, Ran's a professor of sociology at Witwatersrand University. Can I just ask you a question? First of all, you're the first person from Wits that I've spoken to in the modern period, Ran. There's a big furore at the moment about how BDS is horrible and anti-Semitic and how it breaks down communication between those people who should build bridges. I spoke to somebody from Wits University some years ago, and they said that when under the apartheid system, they could easily join, well, they could join the liberation movement and they could call for the boycott of their own university without any sense of contradiction. Could you comment on that?
Well, I think during the apartheid period, academics were not free, obviously, to do whatever they want, but the question of the boycott was not criminalized as such. It fell into a different category than participation in the armed struggle. So I guess the apartheid government was more concerned about activism that took direct participation with the liberation movement. Actions of solidarity within the country, outside of the country, were not perceived to be that damaging. And as a result, there was relative freedom to engage in criticism as long as it was more academic in nature and didn't take the shape of active participation in the actions of organizations that were illegal at the time. So I don't want to idealize the period by any means. Obviously, the ANC was an illegal organization, the Communist Party and various other liberation movements. But in terms of the freedom, at least to engage in theoretical discussion, there was, relatively speaking, quite a liberal possibility of engaging with it.
The most brutal regimes often have eccentric openings, eccentric little bits of democracy. Ran, I've read your book, and I've got a big question. I don't know the answer myself. Your book at the beginning looks at various different trends in Palestine about how to build the future inside the Jewish community, inside the Jewish population, we could say. To what extent was the settler colonial nature or the colonizing nature of the project absolutely inescapable from the very beginning because of the relationship to the British Empire? To what extent was history open in the sense that there were real possibilities for different developments so as not to arrive at the horror that we have today in Palestine? And to what extent is there a rigorous, inexorable logic once you start to colonize a native people with colonists from Europe? Does that make sense as a question?
Yes, I think there were openings, but the openings became more restricted as the conflict ensued. So if we talk about earlier period, and I start with the beginning of the British Mandate period in around 1920, if we look at the 1920s, at least from the side of Jewish settlers, and I include in this group also radical leftists, because the Communist Party in the 1920s was a radical organization composed primarily of Jewish members, recent immigrants, most of them. They were genuinely trying to reach a solution which in our terms today we can call either a single state solution or a binational solution, but in any event, they were obviously against the project of creating a Jewish state and against dispossession of the indigenous population. And they had quite a great deal of support compared to the present among the Jewish population. Obviously, they were a minority. But at some point in time, say in the middle of the 1920s, the Communist Party had about 10% of the votes in various communal and union, you know about the Histadrut elections. Within the Jewish community, they were still marginal, but they were able to operate and to attract people who became disillusioned from the Zionist project. The bi-nationalist movement, which was a Zionist movement, but not Zionism in the sense we speak about it today, but what they used to call spiritual Zionism, that was not aimed at political power, but rather at the possibility of creating a Jewish community inside the country that will live in equality with indigenous Palestinians, also had a measure of support. So both of them are a minority movement, but they had a substantial measure of support. But eventually they declined and were marginalized within the politics of the Jewish community. Why was that the case? Were they able ever to become a majority sort of force in the society? I think the logic of Zionist settlement acted against them. And there was kind of a built-in contradiction, because if you were a recent immigrant, and most members of the bi-nationalist movement, the Communist Party, were recent immigrants, to turn against the movement that brought you there and to challenge it within its fundamental precepts, you could offer a critique, but to challenge the fundamental project was a contradiction. And many people who encountered this contradiction resolved it by leaving the country. So in a sense, critical politics had a built-in obstacle, because if you were serious about challenging Zionism, you had to ask yourself, why are you there? You know, why do you continue to participate in this project? Even if you were critical of the project, you were still part of it. And that kind of dilemma was difficult to resolve. And a lot of people resolved it by either leaving the country or just leaving political activity altogether. So there were possibilities, that's the bottom line, but it was difficult to realize them.
But there were efforts. I forget the author's name. You'll know him very well. The book Comrades and Enemies, which describes the heroic efforts to build real trade unions in the railway industry in Palestine in the 20s, I think it was. But these were crushed by Ben Gurion and the Histadrut, who saw this as absolutely the mortal enemy of the struggle for Jewish labor. So real trade union solidarity, there were efforts, but they were ultimately defeated. Would you comment on that, Ran?
Yeah, I mean, you are referring to Zachary Lachman in his book, Comrades and Enemies, and it is a very interesting discussion of one of these avenues that were open, or at least partly open, and that is labor solidarity. But as you point out correctly, the leadership of the Jewish socialist or the Zionist socialist or the Zionist labor movement, Ben Gurion in particular, regarded this kind of alliance between Jewish immigrants, Palestinian workers, against the common enemy, which they regarded as British imperialism. That was a fundamental challenge to the logic of the Zionist settlement, because even the labor element within it, perhaps precisely the labor element within it, were insistent on regarding labor issues, socialism within a nationalist framework, which did not allow crossing over the line into a binational or internationalist type of solidarity and union formation. So they made some headways, but then indeed, as you pointed out, they were crushed by the much better organized majority group led by Ben Gurion and his colleagues.
At this point, what was the role of the British? Were there differential wage levels in the railway industry? Was it a case of the British and the Zionists working, Ben Gurion working hand in hand to divide that labour force through Jewish privilege against Palestinian labour? Or was it a case of the settler community being much more hard line and the British, in a sense, trying to hold the line and not particularly interested in Jewish labour having privileges?
I think predominantly the British were relatively egalitarian in that sense, that people who were employed by the British government directly, by the colonial administration, received equal wages if they had equal positions. That obviously wasn't the case for the Jewish labor movement, the Zionist labor movement, which wanted to enhance the capacity of its own people to get jobs within the British administration, and of course in other workplaces owned by Jewish immigrants and international companies and so on. So the British in that context, even though they obviously supported the Zionist settlement movement, were in some aspects of their activities more open to allow this kind of relative equality in the labor market, but not entirely, because the terms, you have to look at the terms of the British mandate. And one of the terms was that they had to facilitate the settlement, the immigration and settlement of Jewish immigrants, predominantly from Eastern Europe. So they did allocate some jobs for Jewish immigrants who came in the framework of the Zionist movement, but in other aspects, like in especially the international sector, transport, oil exploration and refineries and so on, these were the one sector of the economy in which there were possibilities of joint organization, because the British didn't allow strict segregation as demanded by the Zionist labor movement.
So the British were not particularly interested in strict segregation. They wanted a safe settler colony, but the Zionist drive for a sort of autarkic economy. You quote authorities in the first part of your book, which are really dramatic, Jewish critics of Zionism, who say that Zionism is radically new in that it buys up land from landlords, absentee, corrupt, whatever, but expels the native tillers, and that this was the dynamic that led to inevitable conflict. Could you comment on that, Ran?
Yeah, I think if you look at it from a historical perspective, you can say it wasn't Jewish settlement as such that was the essential problem. It was Jewish settlement that was undertaken within the framework of creating a Jewish-only industry, Jewish-only workplaces, Jewish-only settlement on the land. In principle, Jews could have, the Zionist movement could have bought land and employed Jewish workers alongside the existing Palestinians who were already working on the land or working in industry. But of course, the problem was that that presented a competition that from an economic perspective they could not tolerate, because Palestinian workers usually were more proficient, higher skilled, more productive and cheaper. So obviously, if you look at it from the perspective of pure generation of profit, it made more sense to employ Palestinian workers and to use the product of Palestinians and peasants. But from the Zionist perspective, of course, if you just follow the market logic, they were at a disadvantage. Hence, they had to introduce political mechanisms in order to exclude Palestinians and create a space in which Jewish immigrants would be able to find employment, would be able to market their agricultural produce, which was more expensive, and that would allow that nucleus of a new society to emerge and to thrive against competition from the Palestinian sector.
So a simple question, maybe a stupid question, but it's simple. with the benefit of hindsight and looking back to that period, when people, and you're right, settlement per se would not be a problem if it brought advantages. People settle all over the world. But given what you've just said about the logic of Palestinian labor being more highly skilled and much cheaper, and Jewish labor coming in unable to compete with it, to what extent was the trajectory of an autarkic, isolated, economically separate Yishuv inevitable? To what extent were those people who were arguing for a more humane, for a different pattern of settlement, to what extent were they doomed from the beginning, and how did they fight for their views, and how were those views ultimately marginalized, Rand?
Well, actually, that was in the first maybe 20, 30 years of the 20th century, until about 1929. That was the biggest debate within the Jewish community known as the Yishuv, and that is the concept of the fight over the concept of conquest of labor and Hebrew labor. When the socialist Zionist, or the Zionist labor movement headed by Ben-Gurion, argued that if you allow free competition of labor, if you allow people, Jewish farmers, Jewish industrialists, to employ Palestinians because they were cheaper, because they were more productive, you would undermine the possibilities of the Jewish-dominated economy, and you would undermine the prospects of the Zionist movement. And they fought against what was known there at the time, the civilian sector, which were also, it was also Zionist, but it was composed of farmers and the urban supporters who argued for a more liberal model of colonization and settlement, which would be problematic in its own right, because what they argued for is basically the classical colonial settlement model as employed by the French in Algeria, by white settlers in South Africa, where you establish enterprises and you use cheap indigenous labor, cheap native labor. That was the logic of capitalist profitability. And that's why the labor movement, the Zionist labor movement, played such a crucial role in the formation of the Jewish community organized around the Zionist project. Because the logic, a pure capitalist logic, would have undermined the prospect of creating an autonomous, I wouldn't use the word autarkic because it wasn't about self-sufficiency, but it was about maintaining economic autonomy. If applied in a sort of pure manner, would have undermined that project. And that's why the labor movement had to introduce political mechanisms to prevent Jewish employers and to try to prevent the British as well from employing the labor of the Arab Palestinian residents and to give preference to Jewish immigrants. Because without guaranteed places of work, Jewish immigrants would not have come to Palestine. So that was quite essential to the success of the Zionist project. And what is ironic in historical terms is that they very consciously rejected the South African model. And there are some quotation, I don't use it in that book, but in some other writings, where Ben-Gurion says in testimony to some International Commission of Inquiry, saying we looked at the Rhodesian, we looked at the South African model, and we rejected it because it wasn't suitable for us. We had to create space for our immigrants, for them to work in all spheres of work, not just be a labor aristocracy, but also to build roads, to work in the fields, to occupy all economic position in the society, because that was essential for our project. So they rejected the classical colonial model, but adopted another model which was more exclusionary and eventually more harmful from the Palestinian perspective.
And what, absolutely. And could we also say, looking back, that perhaps, notions of left and right become very strange in a settler colonial project, yeah? You're in South Africa. I'm reminded of You can tell me what year it was, the great miners' strike in the 20s.
Yeah, 1922.
Where people marched, the miners marched under the slogan, "Workers of the world unite for a white South Africa." So talk about mixed consciousness. But to what extent was what were the main factors in the final evolution of this settler colonial project that we saw leading up to 1948? Was it the iron laws of capitalism, that simply to have any Jewish labor force, it would have to be protected from Arab competition? And to what extent was it the Zionist idea, often expressed in very anti-Semitic language, that Jews were deformed, Jews as a society were unhealthy, didn't have enough street cleaners and manual workers, and that therefore that had to be socially designed in Palestine? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, but I would say I would put the emphasis more on external factors to the Zionist project, external in the sense that they were not controlled by Zionism, and that is also Palestinian resistance, because they obviously were not operating in a vacuum. And with the rise of Palestinian resistance, the 1920s were relatively peaceful period from that perspective. But in 1929, we had a major uprising and clashes, and then it was followed a few years later in 1936. Between 1936 and 1939, there was the Great Arab Revolt. And this manifestation of political resistance on the part of Palestinians also made it more difficult for critical, more liberal, more humanist, more genuinely socialist forces within the Jewish community to become more sort of inclusive. Because one of the difficulties was, especially in 1929, is that from the perspective of many of the Palestinian participants, the distinctions between Jewish settlers, between Zionists, between ultra-Orthodox Jews were kind of blurred. You know, they identify one enemy, and that was the Zionist movement. They didn't make the distinctions between urban and rural, between religious and secular, between socialist and liberal, and so on. And as a result, many people in the Jewish community felt targeted, regardless of their actual practices. And that allowed the Zionist leadership to consolidate support, because they raised the magic word, which is obviously used until this day, and that is the word of security. And when security is at stake, then all the other sort of more humanitarian consideration fall aside. So in that sense, unrestricted and non-discriminatory violence that didn't discriminate between different people in the Jewish community played into the hands of Ben-Gurion and his allies in creating unity around their own projects.
Well, that needs to be explained, because we're just past the anniversary of the killing, the Haganah assassination in 22 of Jacob de Haan, who is the representative of, he's appointed as the spokesperson by the chief rabbi for the native Orthodox Palestinian Jews, I could call them that. How was that Orthodox resistance to Balfour? Because de Haan was campaigning against the Balfour Declaration, wanted to coexist with the native Muslims and Christians. How was that voice weakened and marginalized so that Palestinians come 29 couldn't see that the native Jews and the incoming Zionist Jews were separate groups?
Well, the Orthodox Jewish community in Jerusalem and various other cities that predated Zionism and that was opposed, or at least not part of the Zionist project, was marginalized demographically, because following the Balfour Declaration, there was a large wave of immigration of relatively young Jewish settlers from Eastern Europe predominantly, tens of thousands of people. And most of them, they were young, secular, affiliated mostly with the Zionist movement, the Zionist labor movement, also with the revisionist movement of Jabotinsky. And demographically, they basically marginalized the Orthodox communities that still existed there. In addition to that, they gained, the Zionist organizations gained official recognition from the British mandate authorities as the representatives of the Jewish community. Yeah, and if you look at the text of the mandate, which incorporates the Balfour Declaration, they recognize the Zionist organization as the Jewish agency that represents all Jews. And therefore, all critical voices that were not part of the Zionist organization or Zionist movement were marginalized by the British. The British didn't recognize them as a legitimate voice. And the Zionist movement obviously rejected them as dissidents that no one should listen to. So they were inevitably marginalized by that. And when Palestinians look at the face of the Jewish community, what they saw was the Zionist movement. There were others, of course, but that was the visible presence that they responded to.
It's just a detail, but one of the stories I love about the British attempts to colonize Ireland is that Cromwell took over thousands of soldiers, left them there, absolutely full of hatred of Catholics or contempt for Catholics, and a parliamentary commission went back 20, 35 years later and lamented that all their children were speaking Gaelic because the soldiers had intermingled with native women and been soaked up into the local population. So presumably the secular Zionists they brought along enough women to prevent that process from taking place.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's one thing, but also another thing we have to remember. I call it in another book, the notion of the world historical context. So what was possible to do in the 17th century was different, it changed. And in the 19th and definitely the 20th century, things had changed by then. So if you look at the history of South Africa, for example, you would see the same thing. In the 17th century, even the 18th century, there was quite a great deal of racial mixture between white settlers and indigenous societies. But that sort of came to an end by the end of the 18th century. And the 19th century immigrants and definitely the 20th century immigrants were much more racially exclusionary in that sense than their predecessors. And I think it's true all across the colonial period.
So you have colored populations and demographics and townships in South Africa, but we have no equivalent in Palestine, yeah?
Well, there were, I mean, that's one thing we have to take into consideration. It's not exactly the same. But as everyone is aware, there is a large Jewish population, a large segment of the Jewish population in Israel is of Middle Eastern origin. These are the people that we refer today to as Mizrahim, or used to be known as the Sephardi Jews, but Mizrahim is the contemporary term. And these are people that culturally, socially, are similar or used to be similar to Palestinians. They didn't come from Palestine itself, they came from neighboring countries, but they came predominantly from an Arab cultural background. But the way they were incorporated into Israeli society under the leadership of the Zionist movement forced them to abandon that cultural heritage and to distance themselves from the Arab and Islamic sort of affiliation in order to fit into the new modern Israeli society. So that was the price they had to pay for being accepted as genuine Jews and acquire citizenship and all the rights associated.
Can you expand on that, Ran? People may not know the grim story. By the way, I've got personal interest in a parallel story in Britain and as well as Australia. But the brutal oppression of Yemeni Jews who went to Palestine, who went to Israel, the kidnapping of their children, the the whitening of their children, the racism towards their defectiveness. Why did that not lead? I mean, it led briefly to the Black Panthers, but why was that marginalized, and why is the Mizrahi population at the moment not in any way an immediately potential ally of the Palestinians? But they're sort of rednecks, they're sort of poor whites tied into the system.
I think, I mean, there are two, I would say, two factors here. The one factor is that when they arrived in Israel, especially those who arrived after 1948, they were quite disempowered. They were driven out, some of them were driven out of their original countries, especially the Iraqi Jews, in a sort of collaboration or collusion between the Iraqi government at the time, Nuri Said, the prime minister, and Ben-Gurion reached this kind of tacit agreement. They wanted to get rid of the Jews and control their resources, grab their resources. The Israeli government wanted the immigrants, so they actually arranged for transport. Israeli aircraft landed in Baghdad and carried the entire community virtually into Israel with the collusion of the Iraqi government. The same thing happened in Yemen as well. These are the two sort of early waves of immigration immediately after 1948, by the early 50s. And these people arrived in Israel without resources. They were forced to leave behind their property, their assets, their credentials, educational, professional credentials were disregarded. We have to think
plundered. They were plundered. They were plundered by these regimes in Iraq and elsewhere. And were the British involved in this kind of collusion, or was it purely a Zionist local government?
To some extent, possibly, because at the time, the Iraqi government was affiliated with the British colonial sort of policies. They were independent already, but they were very much pro-British until the wave of sort of more nationalist movement that threw out this regime in 1958 in Iraq. But at that period, they were quite pro-British. But I don't think the British played so much of a direct role. Maybe behind the scenes, they facilitated it. But the important thing is that these people arrived without property, without any recognition from the government, the Israeli government, of their credentials, professional history, their skills and education. They were marginalized. They were sent to transit immigration camps where they lived under poor conditions. And they were quite fragmented. So the notion, the Iraqi, the Yemenites, the Moroccans, the Algerians, they came as separate groups. And only in the course of the subsequent decades, they managed to reconstitute an identity of a group jointly sort of with shared marginalization and shared interest in mobilization. And that happened initially with the Black Panther movement, as you mentioned, that emerged in 1971. But that was a radical movement. The majority of people were actually captured by the right wing. And the reason headed at the time by Menachem Begin, and the reason the right wing could appeal to them rather than the radical solution of the Panthers that remained a marginal group, is because the right wing emphasized the Jewish component in their identity. It appealed to them and says, we are all Jews, let's unite around what we have in common, rather than let's unite around the Arab heritage that you brought with you. And obviously that was more appealing to them than the message of the Black Panthers, which said, we are marginalized, let's unite with other marginalized groups like the Palestinians, because they didn't offer them anything concrete. It's much better to unite with the majority, the dominant group, if they offer you some crumbs, than to join with other marginalized groups and suffer the same kind of oppression and discrimination. So you can't really blame them, because there was no viable alternative affiliation around more radical egalitarian principles that they could join.
Would you like to comment also, Ran? A couple of things, if I may. But first of all, the right Begin captured that demographic electorally. How does that tie in with the fact that the so-called left in Israeli politics is an elite Ashkenazi privileged European group, and therefore which treated the incoming Arab Jews with contempt and opened them up to colonization, electoral by Begin and Shamir and his ilk?
That's a very important point, because from their perspective, the marginalization they experience in the first 2 decades of their arrival in Israel in the 1950s and 60s was the responsibility of the left. It wasn't a genuine radical left. It was the Zionist labor movement headed by Ben-Gurion, but for them it was the left. And as a result, there has been a long-term, decades-long hostility towards anyone who uses the terms of the left. And you can say, well, that wasn't really genuine left. It was a nationalist left. It wasn't really socialist. But from their perspective, that was the left. And importantly, that's similar also to the response of Russian immigrants in the 1980s and 90s, because they also associate the notion of the left and socialism with oppression, because their experience of the left is the Soviet experience. So they have this kind of intrinsic rejection of anyone who speaks the language of socialism, human rights, international solidarity, because in their experience, these were just terms that serve to disguise internally oppressive policies. And it would take a long time to get rid of this legacy.
Of course. One more question about this before we move on to talk about the way forward. Ran, one of our government ministers went to a Zionist meeting, a pro-Israel crowd in Glasgow a few years ago, and one of the members of the crowd jumped up, a question you'll be well familiar with, and said, look, so all these Palestinians, something bad happened to them in 48, but all these Jewish Arabs or Jews in Arab countries were violently expelled and they're refugees as well. So look, let's move on. Even Stephen, the one cancels out the other. We Jews have moved on. We're not crying into our tea, but these Palestinians refuse to move on. So that horrible equation of the violation of Arab Jews and the violation of Palestinians, and one should negate the other. But you're saying that it was a radically different process by means of which these two population movements happened, yeah?
Look, the way I would respond to this kind of comment is that we are indeed fighting for equality and justice and redress for everyone. And that includes those Jews who were forced to leave their countries and homelands in Iraq and Morocco and everywhere else in the Middle East and the Arab world. And there's no contradiction here, because if you support the right of return for Palestinians, you can also support the right of return of those Jews to their home country if they wish. Of course, you wouldn't force them to do that. You would support the restitution of their property and support the restitution of Palestinian property. So the way I see it is not that it evens out and one atrocity or one violation justified or is cancelled out by another. I would say let's join the two struggles together. Give Arab Jews or Jews who came from Arab countries, the term Arab Jews is contested, but Jews who came from Arab countries, give them their rights and give Palestinians their rights. There's no contradiction here. On the contrary, we apply the same principles to all populations.
I couldn't agree more. Both those positions are based on human rights and freedom and choice, and they're anti-Zionist at their core. Yeah? Let's look at the future, Ran. In your book, you conclude the language of class, the language of class struggle and socialism has kind of been marginalized in Israel-Palestine for obvious reasons, that nationality, national struggles against colonialism have moved center stage and that's probably inevitable. But looking at the Middle East at the moment, the devastation in Syria, Iraq, Libya, and so on, the Zionist bloc is always driven by contradictions, but it seems to be held together by a lack of attractiveness, the inability to break the Zionist bloc by those who want to offer a better vision of the future. The leaders can look at the Middle East and say, look, better stay inside the lager, stay inside the Zionist bloc, and keep the world at bay. What's the role of socialists? Because I think they have a key role to play in mapping out some way forward that includes Palestinian liberation. Could you sum up what you said at the end of your book?
Well, I think, like you mentioned now, that the language of socialism has been marginalized. I'm not sure it can recover sufficiently to form the basis of a new movement that would try to bring together Jews and Palestinians, Israelis and Arabs in a movement for human rights and justice and redress. I'm not against that language. I don't think it's been effective so far. So I would put the emphasis on the language of human rights, decolonization, restoration of the legacies of the past that were destroyed both by Israeli Zionism and to a large extent by Arab nationalism as well. Take the example of the Jews, the Mizrahim, the Jews from Arab countries. Like Palestinians, they suffer cultural marginalization. They do have equal political rights within Israel. That's the difference between the so-called Arab Jews and the Palestinians. But they share some concerns that have to do with cultural legacy, with marginalization in the social field, with relatively poor educational, health and other services, and with the lower position within the labor market. So there is a room, objectively speaking, for collaboration on the basis of joint social demands based on their similar positions in the marketplace, in the workplace, in the framework of the economy. But in order to realize that, you have to overcome one important obstacle, and that's the obstacle of nationalism, of Jewish nationalism in particular, obviously, of Zionism, because that prevents people from organizing on the basis of their shared material concerns. So they may recognize these shared material concerns, but they are divided by competing and hostile types of nationalism and racial, national, and religious ideologies. So the biggest challenge is how to overcome the rule of these ideologies. And as you point out correctly, I think, we don't have any kind of positive models right now in the region, in the Middle East, in the Arab world. There are no positive role models that we can follow. Maybe the Kurdish region in Syria or Rojava may provide kind of positive model, but it's too remote from Palestine to be sort of an active force. And I think we do need to build this alternative. But it will, I think, more likely to come as a result of focus on questions of rights and culture than on questions of socialism and class, at least if we look at the historical experience. And I just want to clarify that my book is mostly historical in nature. So my conclusion that the language of class and socialism is not effective is based on a study of the past. It doesn't mean it cannot become effective in the future, but based on the lessons of the past, it's less likely to work. But of course, we can't exclude it, and we do need to build this kind of alternative.
Well, perhaps another way, a darker way to look at that is to say that Israel has 200 or 250 atom bombs. It's extremely dangerous for the entire area. How does one split that Zionist monolith? How do you split that bloc? How do you win some Jews to think that they can get by in the neighborhood without giving their loyalty to an apartheid state? So perhaps we do need some kind of conversation quite soon. I mean, some people are talking about the one democratic state and so on, but that's very much restricted to within the borders of Palestine, of course. But look, 1 million people are marching weekly through Algiers and Algerian cities. There's a very determined uprising taking place in Sudan. I don't want to exaggerate it, but I think all of these struggles for democracy, not socialism, but for democracy, must have some kind of reverberations back in Palestine. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting to look not so long ago in 2011. If you recall, there was a wave of social protest within Israel. It was very similar to the Arab Spring that was taking place, unfolding. At the time, even used some of the similar slogans about social justice, about
the people demand,
the people demand the fall of the regime and so on. But it was done in a framework that excluded Palestinians in the occupied territories and allowed some space for Palestinians within Israel, but quite a marginal space. And that opportunity was lost. It was lost because more conservative forces within the Israeli political mainstream, primarily Yair Lapid, who created this movement that competed in the elections in 2013, sort of hijacked the sense of grievance, socially based grievance of Jewish citizens, and redirected it towards the nationalist mainstream. But I think it is likely that movement like that will re-emerge. But again, the big challenge is how to allow them to break out of the nationalist framework and to consider alliances on the basis of shared social concerns, shared social demands, to form a new type of movement. And I can say, I mean, the one thing I can say with certainty is that the way to approach it is by focusing on so-called bread and butter issues. You can't start with the ideology. You can't start with expecting Israeli Jews to abandon Zionism as an ideological and political movement. You have to start with the real concerns on the ground and to explain how these concern with services, with the cost of living, with living conditions, are tied to the broader political issues, to nationalism, to the role of Israel in the region. But that's a long-term project. I don't want to, I'm not pessimistic about the prospect of it, but I don't want to be unnecessarily, optimistic, because it's a kind of movement that was attempted before. It didn't succeed in the past. We need to allow that it will take a long time. And Palestinians also need to take the initiative. As long as the Palestinian discourse is focused on nationalist concerns, it would be difficult to appeal to Israeli constituencies. So I'm not saying Palestinians should abandon the nationalist framework, but they should incorporate more social concerns with broader concerns with democracy and human rights and social services and so on, to try to appeal to Israeli constituency. But it's an uphill struggle. There's no magic formula that we can, adopt and it would work.
It's a huge subject there. Let's, I like the phrase in your book, Ran, Israel presents itself as a kind of whining or whinging superhero. On the one hand, we are powerful, you can't touch us, 1967, we smashed the Arab armies. On the other hand, terrified of anything. I'm reminded that when some people I know put up posters in the London Underground for BDS about 2 years ago, Netanyahu called in the ambassador, I think, and demanded. So it's preposterous. You're right, a whinging superhero. But what do you think, looking forward, the real state in the Middle East? What, given that Israel is one tremendously unpopular in terms of world public opinion, is now gravitating towards Bolsonaro, a Ukrainian regime that's got a neo-Nazi battalion, which Israel arms, etc., etc. Given, I mean, is this to what extent is this due to Palestinian resistance and the difficulty of Western governments to sell this to liberal public opinion, and that Israel finds a much more congenial ally among these extreme right-wing regimes for the brutality it metes out to the Palestinians? But that's also, and also finally, that also is a huge vulnerability if we know how to exploit it. Can you comment on that, Ran?
Yeah, well, I think we have to look at Israeli actions within the global context. And that's something that happened over the last 20 years, since 9/11 in particular. The shift to the right among many regimes in Eastern Europe, obviously in the US with Trump, but it precedes Trump, is already back to the Bush, George W. Bush government, in Britain as well, with the conservative government, and many other European governments, with the rise of Islamophobia. Israel obviously is taking advantage of these changes. And the way, from its perspective, the international scene is much more positive, especially with some key third world countries moving to the right, India under Modi, Brazil under Bolsonaro. I mean, all these are developments that have nothing directly to do with Israel, but obviously it allows Israel to form alliances with this global sort of, within the context of global right-wing shift. Within the Arab world as well, Israel is all by name diplomatic relations and security collaboration, military collaboration with Saudi Arabia, with the United Arab Emirates, and they take advantage of that. But as long as the Palestinian issue is alive, they cannot really maximize, they cannot really capitalize on all that to the full. So I think from the perspective of European solidarity activists, I think the advantage it gives, potentially it gives them, is to show Israel, the ability to show Israel as it really is. It's a right-wing regime associated with some of the most reactionary forces in Europe and globally as well. Obviously, it's not a coincidence that maybe the only country in the world in which Trump is a superstar is Israel.
Exactly.
So there is, within Europe and within the US as well, there is a lot of discontent about the right-wing shift of regime and governments and the new alliances that are being created. Israel has positioned itself very firmly on the side of these ethno-nationalist, right-wing authoritarian regimes. Let's exploit it in showing this is not, forget all this notion of little Israel fighting for democracy, the sole democracy in the Middle East, the light unto the nations, and all these slogans. It's a very essential component of this right-wing alliance. And so everyone who is committed to liberal, democratic, radical, leftist politics, and I'm including the entire spectrum, even if you are just ordinary liberal, politically speaking, you should be outraged by that. And how to translate this moral outrage into a political movement and a solidarity movement, that's the big challenge we are facing here.
Ran, a final question, because I've got you here and we're got a couple of minutes left. The news. In your book, you point out that the relationship of the Jewish colonizing program to the British Empire was absolutely key in shaping the evolution of that project. Now, do you think, is there any possibility that Israel will attack Iran to serve as a policeman for the Trump regime in the Middle East? What do you think?
I think, well, look, I don't think they will jump the gun and take the initiative without being authorized by the US. So it's very much, we have to look at it in this broader context. And so far it seems, despite very fiery rhetoric, Trump is not that keen on starting a war. I mean, he's very hostile, of course, but he's been quite careful. And it may sound strange, but historically, Netanyahu has also been quite careful. In fact, he attacked Palestinians, obviously, but not as much as other governments, including Labour government. So he's been quite cautious about the use of force, and he obviously would not do anything without Trump agreeing to it. And I don't see this happening anytime soon, especially since the US is entering an election period. And as the saying goes, you always know how you enter a war, you never know how you will get out of it. So I think we are likely to see a lot of tension and hostile, fiery rhetoric in the next year or so, but I don't think it's likely that we'll see major military moves anytime soon.
So it's a radically different world from '56, where Israel worked with France and Britain to chastise Nasser. We don't think they're going to work to chastise the Iranian regime in anything like the same way.
Yeah, well, look, in 1956, it was an attempt, a desperate attempt that failed, but it was an attempt to prevent the demise of colonial rule in the region, when colonial rule was still quite recent, and it seemed to the British and the French as a viable project. But I think with Iran, it's much more complicated, and especially after 40 years of having the Islamic regime in power, it's not going to be easy. And I think Trump knows that, and there's no appetite in the US. Of course, you have people like Bolton who would push for war no matter what, but I think it's less likely today than it was back then, obviously.
Rand Greenstein, thank you very much for joining us today, Rand. We overcame the microphone problems in the first 5 minutes, but I want to say Scottish PSC's got a bunch of these books. We've done a deal with the publisher, so if you want to get a copy of the book, and I strongly urge you to do so, it's a really valuable read, then just get in touch at the end of this broadcast. Rand Greenstein in Johannesburg, thanks very much for joining us today for this interview.
Thank you for having me. It was a great discussion.
My pleasure. Bye-bye, Rand. Okay, guys, so some of the greatest British heroes of all time were pirates. Drake, Raleigh, and so on. And Britain has seized an Iranian tanker off the coast of Gibraltar. The Iranians have done the same. It's a much smaller one, but they've reciprocated, and we're in the middle of a crisis. It's very interesting also, the other item in the news, that when Trump did his racist bile against the 4 women of color who are now members of the US Congress, and insulted them and told them to go back where they came from. What a reptile. They pushed back, which was great. Their determination and lack of fear is very encouraging. We are waiting for you, Trump. We're not afraid of you. But it's amazing. Even American commentators were amazed that Trump, when he launched his racist attack on these 4, one of the first prongs that he used was they hate Israel. Israel just came out of nowhere, it would seem, but of course it's not nowhere. Israel is brandished by the worst racists, and if you don't love Israel, then you're not a friend of the worst racists. It's very, very few exceptions. So friends, thanks very much for listening to the interview with Rand Greenstein. We are going forward next week to interview another Greenstein, Tony Greenstein, who in my humble opinion has been doing excellent work, unparalleled work in dealing with the false accusations of anti-Semitism. Tony's been expelled from the Labour Party, essentially for standing up to the pro-Israel lobby and unmasking them and revealing them for what they are. But Tony will be joining us next Sunday at 4 o'clock, and if you're interested in the madness inside the Labour Party, which seems to be intensifying, with more and more weird accusations of anti-Semitism, then I think Tony Greenstein and the conversation with him you will find very useful. So this interview will be available shortly after we end, which is now. If you want a copy of the book, strongly recommend it, Ran Greenstein's book. And thanks very much for listening. I'm Mick Napier, speaking on behalf of the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and it's another interview with someone significant to contribute to the conversation on Palestine liberation. Thank you again. Goodbye.